welcome to episode 27 of the Data Driven Strength podcast. Today, myself and Zach will be discussing some new research related to proximity to failure for strength and hypertrophy gains. We'll also be talking about a specific point related to how to conceptualize the fitness fatigue model. And then we'll also be discussing how absolute load and absolute strength of a given individual might influence training prescriptions. So, with that out of the way, Zach, I'll kick it over to you and let you chat about three recent studies related to proximity to failure and strength and hypertrophy outcomes.
For sure, man. So, as I think the listeners probably know, we like to keep a finger on the pulse in this research. And then there's been some really solid publications recently that I think have, further shaped the way that we like to kind of communicate these ideas. I think anybody that's been following our content, we kind of started off with that original article and since then have slowly and gradually shifted the way that we communicate these ideas. And I think these three recent studies continue to kind of build that case and help us to really form the way that we communicate the effect of proximity to failure, primarily for strength. So kind of to kick things off, another recent study by Zaros. I think we've talked about the other one before. The other one was basically what we call an interrepetition rest study, where they take let's say 85% of 1RM. One group will perform that for four sets of like 5 to 6 reps. And the other group will do that same 4 sets of 5 to 6 reps, but they'll take an interrepetition rest, meaning between each rep, they'll take about 30 seconds of rest, which in effect will decrease the resultant proximity to failure of the overall set of like 5 or 6 reps. Also decreasing probably the overall velocity loss, which we'll utilize as a rough proxy of intraset fatigue. More recent study came out this time in the bench press by that same research group, found very similar, if not maybe slightly better strength gains in the group training with interrepetition rest, and slight improvements in rate of force development kind of all the way along the spectrum up to 250 milliseconds, I believe, for the interrepetition rest group. Probably some small effect sizes there. This is just off of a brief skim I had. I haven't had time to dig into these super in depth, but briefly looking at the outcomes there, slightly better gains in 1RM strength and probably slightly better improvements in rate of force development. That said, I think an important limitation of that study is that oftentimes in these studies using interrepetition rest, the group training and the traditional approach, oftentimes they'll be taking those sets very close, if not all the way to failure. And if you're following kind of the common dialogue in the evidence-based fitness community, almost no one is going to recommend training all the way to failure for strength. So I think that's an important consideration when we are comparing kind of these two approaches, maybe a lower intraset fatigue approach that we would potentially advocate for, and versus, approach taking sets closer to failure. I don't think most people are advocating for that 0 to 1 RIR approach for strength necessarily. So I don't know if that's a perfect comparison, but nonetheless, they're a group training pretty close to failure, if not all the way, saw similar strength gains to a group taking that interrepetition rest, training farther from failure, and minimizing intraset fatigue. And that's going to be very similar if we kind of compare those results to the couple meta-analyses that we have on this topic by Jukic and colleagues and Davies and colleagues, showing that intraset fatigue or proximity to failure doesn't seem to essentially predict strength gains at the same exact load when volume is equated. So that's really the way we like to think about it. There doesn't seem to be an inherent advantage to either going closer to failure or staying farther from failure, but there doesn't seem to be a cost from doing either one of the two either. So the way that we like to really think about it is, okay, there doesn't seem to be any really acute effects when it comes to strength gains, but there may be downstream effects when we actually take these ideas to practice and incorporate things, when in those situations, things aren't perfectly equated like you would in a research study. We're not perfectly equating training volume. We're not perfectly equating the loads that people are lifting and kind of holding back their rates of progression. And usually there's no form of autoregulation that's implied. So if we utilize those things in practice, we may be able to utilize the spared fatigue of staying farther from failure and minimizing intraset fatigue to take advantage of some of those things. And that's where the second study really comes in here. There was a study by Davies and colleagues. What they did is they have done a few studies where they look at these cluster set approaches or interrepetition rest versus a traditional set approach. And often a common thought behind the cluster set approach is that, okay, pretty reliably we see better maintenance of barbell velocity, lower markers of, fatigue like lactate readings and things like that. So the idea being, okay, these individuals aren't getting quite as much fatigue from the same amount of training volume. Training volume seems to be loosely related to the gains in muscle size and muscle strength. What if we have the cluster set group utilize these approaches to stack on additional training volume? So that's basically what this study looked at. They had the cluster set group perform 6 sets of 5 with about 85% 1RM, if I remember correctly, with interrepetition rest, whereas the traditional set group only performed 3 sets of 5. So the cluster set group is essentially doing twice the training volume. In theory, you would think that would lead to greater strength gains, but in this case, it did not. And I think the strength gains are very similar between groups, indicating that the additional training volume from the cluster set group really didn't have much of an effect. So the idea there is that in our minds, if we are going to take the stance that the primary benefit of sparing some of this interset fatigue is that we're going to have some of these downstream benefits for strength, particularly in the short to moderate term, it may be best based on this evidence to utilize that spared fatigue to really push load as opposed to stacking on additional training volume. Now, whether this is different in the very long term, if we're talking about years, 2 years, whereas that might be a little bit more indicative of hypertrophy, potentially a different answer. But in the context of the studies that we have, somewhere in the 6 to 12 weeks range, which we would consider in most cases the short to moderate term, I think it would make probably the most sense to utilize that spared fatigue from lower intraset fatigue set structures, utilizing more sets and less reps at a given weight, to really push load as opposed to additional training volume. And the way that would look for us in most cases, again, kind of comparing the constraints of research versus the way we might write protocols in practice, is that if you're including an auto-regulated top set, that pretty much is going to allow you to take advantage of that, which is almost never going to be the case in research. If we have a single at an 8 RPE, maybe we can use that spared fatigue of the back off sets to really push the top set load on that top set, and maybe you're able to tolerate that single at 8 to 9 RP rather than a single at 5 to 6 RP. That's really the thinking there, is if we can over time tolerate heavier peak and average loading, in theory, based on the principle of specificity and most of the research looking at load for dynamic 1RM strength, that should lead to better gains in 1RM over time. Now, go ahead.
Yeah, just to jump in here really quick. Do you know off the top of your head how long exactly that Davies study was? The new Davies study?
I want to say 6 weeks. I'm
Yeah.
pretty sure.
Yeah.
Can look it up here quick.
So this is an interesting thing where you might have different considerations in practice, versus looking at this 6 week study and saying, okay, with additional volume, right, from training further from failure, that didn't lead to greater strength gains. I think that's really, really good to know, right? And to be very upfront, like if we would have seen this design before seeing the results, we definitely would have hypothesized that the greater training volumes would have led
For
to
sure.
greater strength gains because of that downstream effect we've talked about. So this is surprising and something that we need to take as take this concept and kind of integrate it into our mental model for this topic of proximity to failure and how it influences strength and hypertrophy outcomes. It's one study though, right? So we kind of need to take it for what it is. But the point I want to make is, in practice, typically when you're working with an athlete, your goal is to get them as strong as possible in the order of months to years, right? Whereas in a study, a short-term study, we're talking about 6 to 12 weeks. In this study, it sounds like was closer to 6 weeks. So hey, that's really good to know. If you're looking to get the absolute most out of your training in the next 6 to 8 weeks, and you're using some of these quote unquote low fatigue strategies we often vouch for, or at least say, hey, this is something worth considering. Maybe prioritizing load, as kind of something that you can increase because you have less fatigue from these low fatigue strategies, right?
And I
But
think,
when you're
yeah,
working with
go ahead.
an athlete and you're trying to maximize strength, again on the order of months to years, it might make sense to increase the volume because that might have payoffs in the longer term, right? So that's kind of just a consideration when thinking about applying these, kind of the time scale of these adaptations we're talking about, because 6 weeks might not have been sufficient to actually see the benefits of increased training volume. Let me know if you disagree with that.
No, that's totally right. And I think one thing I was going to bring up, that mistake even I made, many times when kind of talking about the dose response relationship between strength and volume. I think if you go back and look at that Ralston meta-analysis, like it is definitely not clear. Like it's not a very clear relationship. Like the hypertrophy one is a little bit more clear. I think the effect size for like the upper training volumes is like 0.54 for hypertrophy, whereas for strength it was like barely touch and trivial. So I think that's another thing to keep in mind, especially in the short term. That probably is something to keep in mind. And so when we kind of look at the landscape of strength research in general, um, peak load really seems to predict outcomes a vast majority of the time. And so, when we're utilizing these strategies and thinking about things, I think, again, in that short to moderate term, that's probably the factor you're going to want to prioritize. But again, as your scope shifts outwards and the time period becomes longer, I think that's where you can start making a different case, depending on ultimately the timeline in which you're discussing the benefit of those strategies for sure.
And to be clear, just to kind of wrap this up, like because we do see, a much more convincing effect size, as you noted, Zach, for the dose response relationship between volume and hypertrophy, and because our current mental model for long term strength gains is to maximize hypertrophy of the prime movers, in practice, we are not huge fans of creating training cycles that decrease in training volume throughout them, simply for the fact that by reducing training volume, that is sacrificing long-term hypertrophy outcomes, which is going to put that individual in a worse position in the long term. Right? We'll take the slight hit in terms of the gains you make in the next 6 weeks if that means that in the long term you're able to kind of be at a more steady training volume. But again, by kind of conceptualizing that and keeping that in the back of your mind, you can know when to pull the trigger on, okay, instead of increasing volume as a result of lower interset fatigue, we're going to increase load in the short term when in 6 weeks you have a meet or something that is very, very important, for example, right? So this is kind of how you can conceptualize and integrate these concepts.
Yep. Yep. Totally agree with that. And then, really, just to round out this kind of series of studies, there was another recent study that was um, out there that basically looked at one of the limitations that I just mentioned is oftentimes the traditional set group is training very close, if not to failure, a majority of the time. So we're kind of comparing a lower intercept fatigue strategy to a strategy that's a little bit closer to failure. One of the knocks on that is that, yeah, okay, we would expect strength gains to be similar or maybe and sometimes a little bit better in the group staying away from failure for strength specifically. So a more recent study by Cuevas Alberto, I think is the way that you pronounce the author. I apologize if I messed that up. They basically looked at a non-failure traditional set approach versus a inter-repetition rest in which they did 30 repetitions kind of straight with rest intervals between every single one of those reps. I think it was about 30 seconds rest. And they found very similar gains in strength. The other group was doing 6 sets of 5 at about 75% of 1RM on the bench press, which, first set's probably going to be around a 5 RP, might get up to 2 or 3 RAR on that last set, which I think is going to be much more indicative of how people would generally train for strength. And the point being there, the other group doing singles, the first one's probably going to be 9 RAR, seem to lead to similar strength gains. And the obviously the standard caveats apply: the trainedness of the population, length of the intervention. It's not indicative of an entire training program. Most of the time, they're only using one lift. A lot of caveats go into this, but interesting nonetheless. That again, the load seems to really predict strength gains, and the set structure seems to be a secondary factor that we can kind of play with to have the theoretical benefits of downstream effects. And just to kind of play devil's advocate again, we advocate for these approaches. Sometimes I think a lot of people prematurely take them off the table. I think that's probably one reason we like to bring it up. But it doesn't necessarily mean we think there's no utility to the other style as well. Like if you are trying to accumulate volume in potentially a more time efficient fashion, while we would often advocate that you can do a more low fatigue, higher set approach in that, I think we would both agree that just the logistic feasibility of an approach that's going to take each set closer to failure is probably going to work better for most people if you're trying to accumulate a good amount of training volume. So again, there are times and place to utilize these other strategies. It's just in the short to moderate term for strength, load seems to be the predominant factor that predicts these things, and set structure seems to be a secondary factor. In our mind, if you can get similar strength gains with a lower overall fatigue approach. You can utilize that effort elsewhere, auto-regulated top sets, pushing loads on throughout the week, and hopefully sparing some fatigue on maybe some of your volume work. That's really the way we view it. Not the end all be all, but some interesting research nonetheless to kind of shift that perspective of potentially automatically. I think early on we would say you would 100% get greater strength gains within a set that spared intraset fatigue. I think we've definitely come off that approach, uh, mostly just kind of really thinking about the way that the evidence plays out and how I've communicated the ideas. I think now we really view it as like this, like I said, these downstream benefits of fatigue management rather than, like I think I've talked about this on a few different podcasts now. We used to kind of plot the force under the curve and like talk about that as a proxy of the strength stimulus. I think that probably is something we would change our minds on how we communicate that now. I think we obviously still think there's benefits to training with higher average force production in general, things like that, but it is in fact a proxy argument, and as we've talked about in my other podcasts, that has limitations. And when we're looking at the actual applied outcomes, it seems to be similar strength gains, and then we need to think about the limitations of the studies and ultimately what we can glean from that. And I think it really is just an equation of fatigue management, and that is going to dictate how these strategies are best utilized rather than thinking about it as an automatically superior way to organize the training volume. Josh, does that check out?
Yeah, I think that was really good. I think just the overall take home is that if you were to think of um, if you really pinned us down and said give us kind of like the hierarchy of training variables for strength in the short to moderate term, proximity to failure slash set structure is going to be dead last, right? Because things like volume, load, frequency are going to likely actually drive the response. Whereas proximity to failure, again, in and of itself, is not going to actually, it does not seem to have a direct effect on strength outcomes at this time, but it has lots of
At a given week.
indirect effects, right? It has indirect effects perhaps on volume tolerance. It has indirect effects on potentially top set loads, like you said, Zach. Maybe you're able to go from benching 3 times a week to 4 times a week, with that fourth day being, quite far from failure, kind of in like, a lower fatigue approach that we talk about. So again, it's kind of those indirect effects is kind of where we're at right now. But as always, that's going to be subject to change as more stuff comes out. And the final thing that I do want to circle back to is again related to that Davies study. Is it might be helpful to think of alternative set structures, or these like low fatigue set structures we talk about, as being a tool in your tool belt for when kind of the training stress you're trying to impose is no longer tolerable, right? So in other words, perhaps in the cohort for the Davies study, um, the the lower training volumes in kind of the traditional group were totally fine, right? And you didn't really need to mess with it, and that it's probably better just keep it simple, right? But let's say the cohort needed that higher volume that was present um, in the alternative group, then okay, maybe they would have benefited from it. So again, in practice, this is going to be on a case by case basis.
That's funny. It's funny you say that because I think it's so interesting to kind of look back at like how we used to communicate this. I remember when we started first talking about this, and we kind of had the periodization graph where you had the traditional periodization, volume decreases throughout a training cycle, and intensity, which we would probably redefine now, but primarily load goes up throughout a training cycle. And our kind of original argument was, okay, load has to go up. We all believe that's generally a good idea for peaking strength. We're just switching the factor that's allowing that to happen. Is instead of load and proximity to failure both rising throughout the training cycle, we're just flipping that a little bit to say let's keep volume similar, as that seems to be important for not only strength practice but also for hypertrophy, and then let's decrease the proximity to failure. And that was really the extent of what it was. And I think that's exactly what you're saying now. Is it's just we're going to design an initial batch of training when we get an individual that's going to be not right on the line of their recovery capacity, but a good amount of training stress that's going to push them and hopefully lead to some progress. And then that's going to feature moderate to high loading still, but when we want to turn that up another gear, something's got to give. And I think that's where we kind of start to view these strategies now, is like that's kind of how we get to that general, starting framework of periodization is that, okay, we have a good batch of training for an individual. As we get closer to meet, generally we want to have some additional exposure to heavier loads or higher average loads. Let's drop that proximity to failure back a little bit by flipping these set structures, and that's going to allow us to continue to do that. It's really, it doesn't have to be more complicated than that. Like Josh said, it's just another tool in your tool belt. And in some cases, if you're not really pushing the training stress, that may not be totally necessary, and can have some drawbacks for some individuals as well.
Yep. Well said, man.
Cool.
Good to move on to the next part.
Yep. I was gonna just intro that here for you.
Yeah, go for
So
it.
Josh is gonna. We've been talking about the kind of fitness fatigue model and kind of how we view that quite a bit here. And Josh had a recent webinar that really touched on this concept a bit. So he's going to break down some thoughts here on the way that he kind of views the equation for performance and some factors that maybe aren't often considered.
Yeah, so in terms of that webinar, so that was webinar number 16 that we released for people on our individualized programming self-coaching toolkit product. Um, and there was, when I was kind of brushing up on some papers in preparation for this webinar, there was a paper. The first author is, I believe it's pronounced Greek. I could be mispronouncing that, but the title is Autoregulation and Resistance Training: Addressing the Inconsistencies. Um, and I really like the definition they use there. So they define it as an approach to exercise programming that adjusts training variables based on the assessment of an individual's performance or perception thereof. Okay, so in other words, what we're trying to do with autoregulation is we're trying to match a certain training variable or variables, plural, based on the performance of that given day. Okay. And they also have a really interesting uh, kind of like formula for what your theoretical performance is on a given day, and it was kind of like a light bulb moment for me, or just like oh, that's a really nice way of putting it. So to take a step back, I think a lot of people like to throw around the word readiness as kind of an indication of performance. So in other words, they'll kind of use performance and readiness synonymously. Okay, so you might hear someone say, yeah, I'm using RPE based training because it allows me to match the training on that day to my readiness on that day. Whereas I really like the way this specific paper talked about it. Okay. So what they did is they said, okay, performance is equal to fitness plus fatigue plus readiness. So, in other words, again, performance and readiness are separate variables. Readiness influences performance. Okay. And the way that they kind of talked about it is hey, fitness and fatigue, those are influenced by the actual training you're doing, right? Every single time you do a bout of training, your theoretical fitness is going to go up, right? You're making adaptations to training, but there's also going to be a fatigue cost. Everybody intuitively knows that if you try to do the same exact squat workout 6 hours later, that you're going to be under fatigue and not going to be able to perform as well. Okay. But again, this readiness piece is also layered on. Okay. And readiness is going to be, again, by the way they define it, which I really like, is it's going to be non-training factors. Okay. So in other words, we have this fitness and fatigue that's actually a result of the training. Then we have to add in readiness. Okay. These are going to be factors from outside of the gym. And that's all going to feed into performance. And then on a day-to-day basis, we're using certain tools, whether that's RPE, velocity, to match the training protocol to our performance on the given day, right? So again, the purpose of me explaining this is to hopefully add a better conceptual framework for differentiating between performance and readiness, right? Readiness factors into performance. They are not one and the same, which I think a lot of people kind of conflate those two ideas. Zach, does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess one question I have off the back of that is: do you think there is any practical downfalls that are often resulting from the slight misunderstanding of readiness versus performance? Like, if you're only taking into account readiness to influence performance and kind of viewing those two words synonymously rather than viewing readiness itself as a factor in that equation, is there a common downfall in the way autoregulation is handled because of that misunderstanding?
That's a good question, right? Because at the end of the day, I'm kind of discussing this theoretical, I guess, inconsistency, or trying to define this theoretically. But how does this actually influence practice? Off the top of my head, I think I think just trying to I think okay, so this is what I talked about in the webinar, and I think this is where the practical implications really come in, is that on a day to day basis, as training status increases, readiness is going to influence performance more than the fitness and fatigue dynamics. So that might sound a little bit like weird at first, but hear me out, right? If you take a rank beginner, their fitness is going to increase extremely quickly, right? Whereas if you take somebody that's been training for 5 to 10 years, their fitness is not going to increase at the same rate. Their rate of adaptation slows down. You might see progress block to block, cycle to cycle, year to year, as opposed to week or session to session. Okay. Then on a day to day basis, what's really going to be driving or what's going to have a larger relative contribution to day-to-day performance is going to be those readiness factors. Okay. And if you're simply thinking of performance as a result of fitness and fatigue, and you're not kind of layering in those non-training readiness factors, you might not be able to like conceptually accept that. Right. We see it all the time with lifters we work with, especially like more advanced trainees, is that day-to-day, week-to-week performance is quite variable, and that's just because those readiness factors are going to fluctuate a lot more than the rate at which they're increasing their actual fitness. Whereas a beginner, they're going to be progressing week to week because fitness is just increasing so predictably. Does that make
Yeah, I
sense?
think yeah, I think another thing that comes to mind for me is like uh, potential misunderstanding with this too is like if you're only viewing readiness as the only input, potentially you would kind of have that self-fulfilling prophecy type problem as well. Like if you sleep poorly, if you're viewing that as the primary input rather than understanding it's a kind of a combination of fitness fatigue from training and this readiness that's from outside the gym, bad night of sleep, automatically my performance is going to be down. Handling my nutrition, handling my sleep, I'm taking everything really seriously, which is often also part of this. I think it isn't talked about. It's easy to talk about the times when sleep's poor, nutrition's poor, and then performance exceeds expectations. But I think the opposite also happens sometimes too, where maybe you are dialing your nutrition, are dialing in your sleep, but fatigue from training is just really, really high. And so you go in, and your performance maybe is still down, and maybe psychologically that messes with you because your outside of gym factors are in check. But understanding that there's multiple inputs to the ultimate resulting performance is important to keep in mind there so that your expectations can be in line with actually what's happening in the gym. And I think that that meshing of those two things, understanding there's multiple factors that actually come into that resulting performance, make it easier so that lifters, when they do have kind of this mismatch in how they maybe subjectively feel on a day-to-day basis and what happens in the gym, they can kind of understand there are these two things that are going on underneath the hood in addition to your kind of subjective experience that influence the ultimate resulting performance, that could lead to that kind of, like I said, that mismatch of expectations sometimes. So I think that keeping that in mind, to me at least, is something you can explain to somebody when they feel like they're checking off all the variables and maybe fatigue is just really high from maybe close to a deload. And the same thing with vice versa. If your resulting life stress is super, super high, nutrition is maybe a little bit off because of that. Maybe that's playing a role in why your performance isn't where it wants to be, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's well said. And to really talk about the practical applications here, I think that by really focusing on performance being the variable we're trying to determine for the day in order to inform those auto-regulated variables is huge. Because I think if you think of it as I'm going in and I'm hitting my top set triplet RP8 based on my readiness, which again is often kind of associated with non-training factors, you might kind of view it as a one-to-one input of like, oh, nutrition's off, sleep's off, tough day at work. Thus, I'm going to expect that load selection is going to be down, and I'm going to have to match it to readiness. Whereas if you keep the focus on performance, you it like then you know that readiness is just one factor there. This training block might be going really well for you, and you're seeing fitness increase at a considerable pace that it kind of drowns out that readiness, right? So I think again, more than anything, what the take home can be for the listeners, like at the end of the day, autoregulation. The goal is to take those autoregulated variables, whatever they are in your program, match it to performance on that given day, have a nice way of kind of determining your performance on that day, whether that's a specific protocol for warmups or specific velocity parameters, and then match the autoregulated variables to performance and think of readiness as just one factor that goes into that. Cool. All right, we will move on to a question that we got from Will W. So this was a really, really good question, and we wanted to make time for it on today's episode. Um, so Will says, you guys have talked about the importance of training at an appropriate relative load when training at lower RPEs, which is really awesome to hear because we totally agree. Um, if you are going to be training with lower interset fatigue, you probably want load to be relatively high. And then his question is, do you think there is a relationship with absolute load too? If someone who squats 300 kilos, are they more likely to benefit from lower RPE work with lower relative loads as opposed to someone squatting 150 kilos?
Yeah, this is a really good question. I think the first thing to say off the gate here is a lot of this is speculation and anecdote. This is a really hard question to directly address with like research. I don't think there is anything to my knowledge that is going to help us kind of establish that relationship. But in my mind, in my experience, I think absolute load 100% plays a role in kind of this equation. It's hard to say how much, like I said, in kind of comparison to the other factors, but a few things to keep in mind for me is that I have not personally kind of dug into this myself, but I know Greg Knuckles has talked about the kind of energetic demands for somebody lifting a greater absolute load seem to be greater, kind of scales with the actual absolute load that you're lifting. So the way that I've kind of explained this to some of my clients is that, early on in your kind of training career, each set, creates a given amount of fatigue at a given relative load. But probably as you get stronger, the absolute load is increasing in that same exercise. That almost certainly comes with a greater fatigue cost per set at the same relative load, same number of repetitions, same number of RP. Again, can't say that super confidently, but there seems to be at least a plausible explanation to fit with the anecdote of many people that seem to support that. So I would say that's one thing to keep in mind. And generally, I also think that there are some other physiological things that you could consider that probably impact the stimulus side of things as well. If we think about some of the physiological adaptations to kind of try to hopefully maximize maximal strength, some of that at least seems to be related to the absolute amount of force that you're putting through a joint or putting through a muscle. And if you have a greater absolute load, that probably contributes to the actual forces you're putting through the musculotendinous unit that maybe improve things like tendon stiffness, some of the theorized benefits of like costomeres connecting to the muscle fiber, things like that. There may be absolute benefits to just lifting those heavy absolute loads, which could contribute to the ultimate training prescription if you can get away with those things at a sub-maximal relative load, even though you're lifting a greater absolute load, if that makes sense. And then finally, the other thing I've thought about, that if you have somebody that's more well trained, generally they're going to be, this kind of term of neural efficiency. There's a lot of components that go into that, all the way from the spinal cord down to the transmission of the neuron to the muscle. There's a lot of particular adaptations that happen from that kind of quote unquote neural efficiency. But using that term broadly, the more well trained somebody is, generally the more neurally efficient they are, you likely can exhibit peak forces with lower relative loads because you're able to accelerate the bar faster. And as we've talked about, at a given load, being able to accelerate a bar faster means you're producing more force. So theoretically, because of that, if you're able to kind of reach peak force production with lower absolute loads, you may be able to get a more effective stimulus out of that load if we think force production is one of the parts of the training stimulus that matters. Once again, that's a proxy argument, but it kind of makes sense to me. If you're more neurally efficient, you may be able to get more out of a lower relative load. So in all those things are to say that the more trained you get, the greater absolute loads you lift. I think the equation and kind of the way that you view the training stimulus might change a little bit because of some of the benefits you get for lifting a heavier absolute load. Additionally, that comes along with an additional fatigue cost as well. So that's kind of what comes to mind for me. Is I definitely think that plays a part of the equation. Generally, people who are much stronger, you're going to have to be, thinking about that when it comes to the absolute amount of volume you're prescribing, the loads you're prescribing. You can't have somebody that probably squats 800 pounds working up to that 3 times a week in most cases. That's just not gonna. That's just not. I like the example that always comes to mind is Ray Williams talking about his training program. Like, would you ask Ray Williams to squat 3 singles at 8 a week? Probably not. So just things like that you got to keep in mind on the extreme ends of the bell curve. And then yeah, just some theoretical benefits of why you may be able to get more out of a lower relative load for somebody that is in an absolute sense stronger. Does that make sense, Josh? I don't know if that carried.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And I was going to mention that anecdotal kind of observation that I think is intuitive when you think about it. It's like you don't see many people with high absolute strength, whether it's because they're strong relative to their body weight, or just because they're, a larger individual, higher body weight, and thus are going to be, generally have higher absolute strength. You don't see them doing like a ton of doubles at 95% all the time in their training program. Like that's just going to be really, really hard to do. Whereas if you give doubles at 95% to, either someone earlier in their training career or a later individual like that, seems to just anecdotally be a little bit more realistic, right? So take that for what it is, just kind of an observation that I think most people would agree with. And yeah, to be very clear, like we're kind of just going off the cuff here. There isn't direct research on this to our knowledge. Um, and in fact, like if you the research we do have would kind of indicate that relative load for the individual, or in other words, percentage of one rep max, doesn't seem to drive fatigue, right? So in other words, having a like doing sets to failure with a greater percentage of your one rep max does not seem to lead to greater fatigue than sets to failure with a lower percentage of your one rep max. In fact, it's actually the opposite is what we see in the research. We see that lower loads actually lead to a longer time course of recovery. Now, this is something that may or may not actually play out in practice, and I think this is, just something that from working with athletes, there just seems to be something to percentage of one rep max influencing time course of recovery, or at least feelings of aches and pains and things like that. Um, so again, based on the research, relative load doesn't seem to drive fatigue, but in practice, absolute load kind of seems to, right? And those studies don't actually look at absolute load; they look at relative load within an individual. Whereas in practice, if you have people that are on average stronger than the subjects in those cohorts, it might actually be that, hey, absolute load in and of itself is an important variable that influences fatigue, but we don't really detect that in these individuals because their one rep maxes are lower compared to the average person we might work with in practice. So that's kind of where I stand on that. Largely anecdotal. Zach, anything to add?
No, for sure. I just want to double down on the fact that we're just really just a spitball question. Like this would be something I'd be interested to see. Like I guess I'm now my mind goes like thinking of study designs on how would you examine this, because you want it to be, we couldn't examine like cross sectionally really like somebody that is really really strong and somebody that's not super strong, and look at that in like a, I don't know, standardized training protocol. Maybe you do 3 sets of 10 and the 8 RPE for that individual. That probably wouldn't work because we want to know each individual is going to have their own fatigue characteristics aside from the load that they're actually using. So you'd probably want to have them train longitudinally, get stronger, and then have them do another damaging bout. But then it's like, okay, if we train people for 8 weeks, is that the degree of magnitude that we're really talking about in the case of training somebody for, 5 to 10 years and they put, 100 kilos on their squat or whatever? Like that's going to be considerably different rather than the little bit of strength gain we might see in a training study. So yeah, just really spitballing how we could actually objectively investigate this now, because right now we're just kind of flying by the seat of our pants.
Cool. Zach, I meant to say this when we started the podcast. Um, Man, it would have been so much better if I said it at the start of the podcast. But we got a comment on our latest podcast on YouTube, and I'm going to read it verbatim for you.
No, great.
Okay. Yo, it's been long enough. Spit a podcast on Spotify. I've already listened to every episode like 3 times. So
That's
we're just pleasing the people by recording this.
that's pretty cool.
Yeah. So
Not gonna give them, not even gonna
hopefully
give them a shout out. You're just gonna just read their comment and the nice
I
compliment that they give. They don't even get the
I
recognition.
copy and paste it. I copy and
Man,
pasted it. I don't remember the
yeah,
name.
you're gonna get
Um,
another comment this time.
hopefully we'll release episode 28 so that you only have to listen to this one 2 times. But if you drop another comment like that, then maybe we'll record it a week earlier than we originally
Don't
would.
worry, you don't get credit though.
Yep. All right. Anything else to add, Zach?
Nope.
Cool. If you want to kind of support what we're doing, it would be much appreciated if you could head over to iTunes, leave a rating and a review.
More
Check
questions.
out some
More
of the stuff.
questions too.
Yeah, questions. There is a link. It's in the description, right, Zach?
Yep.
Yep, there's a link to a Google form to drop some questions. I think there are some in there that we have to catch up on. But hey, if you have a good question, then we'll probably answer it on the show. Again, leave us a rating and review. Take a screenshot of this, throw it up on an Instagram story, share it on social media. Check out the stuff in the description that we offer. And thank you for listening. Take care.
Thanks, guys.